It had been weeks since Evelyn could remember a decent night's sleep. The days blurred now, thick and slow, each one clouded by exhaustion that settled deep behind her eyes. She had come to this old rental house on the edge of town, hoping that quiet would shield her from the noise of her own regrets. But quiet has a way of becoming something else at night, especially when the hours drag past midnight and the cold creeps in through the cracks no matter how tightly she pulled her blanket up around her shoulders. It was always worse just before dawn. Evelyn lay on her back in bed, staring up at the old plaster ceiling, its dim outline visible from the faint orange glow of a distant streetlight outside her window. Shadows pressed against the walls, soft but somehow heavy. She let her gaze drift to the digital clock on the nightstand. It read 3:16 a.m., yet another night spent chasing sleep that wouldn't come. The house was still, not just ordinary stillness, but a kind that made her almost afraid to move, in case she broke whatever spell kept everything in place. The only noise was the slow and ancient ticking from the wall clock out in the hall, its hands stubbornly creeping onward, minute by minute. Something felt different tonight, but Evelyn was too tired to grasp what. Each shift in the mattress fabric, each sigh of the old walls settling, stood out against the hush. She wrapped her blanket tighter, shivering even though the thermostat hummed at its usual setting. Her mind wandered, replaying arguments, the harsh words and slammed doors from her former life, the loneliness that bloomed quietly in the aftermath. Sleep had once been her escape. Now, each night stretched too long, leaving her carcassed by regrets and fretful imaginings. The ticking in the hall marked the passage of time in a way that felt ancient, almost predatory. The minute hand nudged forward, and Evelyn's gaze fell back to the clock on her nightstand. At the exact moment the crimson numbers flickered to life, 3:17 a.m., her skin prickled. The air in the room seemed to draw in upon itself, holding a breath she could not hear. For a moment, her own breath sounded too loud in her own ears. She almost laughed at herself, the way fear clawed up her back, irrational and childish. She squeezed her eyes shut, determined to let herself drift, but her body stayed rigid, waiting. Within days, a pattern emerged, as undeniable as the numbers lighting up beside her bed. Evelyn would doze off around midnight, waking with a sudden start that seemed totally detached from any dream. She'd fumble for her phone or stare at the pulsing red clock. Always 3:17. Always that tick, tick, tick from the hallway, louder than she remembered in daylight. Each time, she felt drained, as if whatever little rest she managed to steal away was snatched by invisible hands the moment she hit that hour. On the third night, something changed. The restlessness wasn't just inside her this time, the cold at the foot of the bed felt deeper, sharp against her ankles. She drew her knees up, but it trailed higher, as if the cold were not just air, but something moving, something present. She told herself it was nothing, that the night's chill was sinking in through the old floorboards, that her nerves were working against her, as they always did. The mattress dipped, just slightly, in a way that made her heart hammer in her chest. She lay still, frozen, eyes squeezed closed, listening for any other sound. The night stretched on and there was nothing, no footfalls, no breathing, only the sense that someone sat at the edge of her bed, perfectly silent. Her skin burned with the urge to look, but terror rooted her in place. Minutes or maybe hours passed like that, until the first hint of dawn began to bleach the room, and she found herself alone again. The spot at the foot of the bed was empty, nothing there but a faint coolness she imagined she could still feel against her leg. Evelyn told herself it was exhaustion, pure and simple. She even said it aloud one morning, voice hoarse, coffee cooling rapidly in her hands. She tried to believe it as she eyed the antique clock on the wall, its brass pendulum swinging with that same slow, deliberate pace. The cold, the sense of a presence, just tricks of a lonely, tired mind. She reasoned that people have night terrors, sleep paralysis, all sorts of strange things when they're under stress. Still, the way the mattress had felt, pressed down at the edge, was hard to dismiss. Her body remembered the weight, even if her mind tried to forget. That day, every little sound made her flinch. Pipes whining in the walls, floorboards shifting with the movement of her feet, the distant roar of wind against the thin windows. In the bathroom mirror, Evelyn caught her own reflection staring back pale and rimmed with the evidence of another night lost. She moved slowly around the house, double-checking locks, closing drapes, turning on lights that only half chased the shadows away. She tried to nap on the couch, but sleep would not come. As night fell again and the hours grew thick and silent, Evelyn moved through her evening rituals with uneasy care. Teeth brushed, face washed, slippers lined up next to the bed. She considered calling someone, maybe leaving a lamp on, but the thought only made her feel more exposed. She wasn't afraid of the dark, she told herself, not really. She hesitated at the switch before turning off the light, listening to the house sigh. The cold at her feet seemed sharper than usual as she slipped into bed, but she tugged the comforter higher, settling in, determined to conquer her fear by ignoring it. It was nothing, she whispered. There was no one here but her. Yet, as she lay there waiting for sleep, she found herself glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl ever closer to that time. The blankets felt oddly heavy, pressing her down, and again the room seemed to tighten around her. Tick, tick, tick. Each heartbeat counted down to the moment she now dreaded. The loneliness in the room was no longer silent, it was loud, oppressive, almost suffocating. And the cold at the end of the bed waited, patient as ever, for 3:17. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old glass of her window. Inside, the shadows pressed in, thick and thoughtful, as Evelyn lay staring at the ceiling, forcing herself not to look toward her feet, not to give fear any more ground. She told herself she was imagining everything, that when morning came, it would all seem silly and distant. But in her bones, she knew, something had changed. Something was waiting, just out of sight, just at the edge of sound, biding its time until that red glow flipped over again, and the weight settled back onto her bed. Evelyn spent most of the next day in a fog. Even after the weak sun had risen outside her frost-dulled windows, she moved slowly, her body heavy with lack of sleep. She tried to tell herself that nothing had happened last night, that she was just tired, just unsettled by the unfamiliar house and its sighing old bones. But every so often, a flicker of memory would come, cold and sharp, the way the shadows had clung to the corners, the deep silence pressing in from all sides. How she had lain there, watching the glowing red numerals ticking over from 316 to 317, and how the world felt different after that. Evening dragged itself in again, rolling up the last of the light with a careful hand. Evelyn tried to fill the empty spaces of the house with sound, turning the radio up while she made herself soup, letting the thin voices wash through each room. But music and chatter faded as the hours crept on. By midnight, she was alone with nothing again but the wind, cold drafts whispering through unseen cracks, and the faint groan of the floor settling under old secrets. She moved through the bedtime motions slowly, folding and refolding the blanket at the end of the bed, straightening the lamp, double-checking the lock on the window. When she finally climbed into bed, her skin prickled with that odd sense that she was repeating something, that she was acting out the memory of last night. The house itself seemed to watch her. She left the lamp on, a weak, warm circle against the gloom, and placed the digital clock where she could watch it from her pillow. 2:50 a.m. Plenty of time, she told herself, to prove that nothing unusual happened. But her eyelids felt like they were filling with lead. She sat up and forced herself to scroll through her phone, headlines, photos, meaningless chatter, but soon it all blurred together. She blinked, rubbed at her eyes, stretched. Each time she checked, the hands of the clock had lurched forward more than she expected. 3:11, 3:13. She slapped her cheeks lightly, trying to stay awake. The background noise faded, and with it, her will to fight off sleep. She woke with a jolt to the harsh silence. The world felt paused, just for her. Evelyn's eyes snapped to the clock. 3:17, of course. For a few long, heart-pounding seconds, she was unsure what had startled her awake. It was quiet, not the ordinary hush of a sleeping house, but a quiet so deep it seemed to come from the walls themselves, thick and suffocating. Then she felt it, before she truly saw it, a slight shift of the mattress at her feet, a distant kind of weight. She lifted her head from the pillow and stared at the foot of her bed, skin tingling in dread. There, just at the edge of the lamp's glow, was a shape, a darker shadow against the low gleam of her old blanket. The outline was faint, distant from certainty, but it was the feeling that made her certain. Something sat there, just at the foot of her bed. In her half-fogged mind, she wondered if it had always been there, in the hour between night and morning. She tried to focus, puzzle out details, but any time her eyes adjusted, the shape melted into the gloom. Still, the sense of being watched was so sharp, so intimate, that her heart ached in her chest. Evelyn tried to will herself to speak, to ask, to demand, to plead, but for a long time all she could do was stare. The house felt even older, somehow, ancient and full of years that stretched out behind her. She heard it then, the slow, quiet breathing at the end of the bed. Not hers. Something else. Shallow, measured, as unhurried as the ticking clock by her head. The sound made her stomach turn to ice. She pressed herself deeper into the mattress, gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles hurt. She felt certain that if she moved, something would respond. The air was sharp and cold on her arms, but the edge of the bed felt colder still. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, then forced them open again, not daring to lose sight of the spot. The shape did not move, the breathing did not change. It was simply there, watching, waiting, patient as the wood groaning in the walls. After a while, Evelyn found her voice, though it barely sounded like her own. She whispered into the dark, her throat scratchy and dry. "Who are you?" Her words fell heavily, swallowed by the thick air. Silence answered her, silence and those gentle, unhurried breaths. It felt almost worse than a response. The watcher did not speak. She was certain it could hear her, though, and that knowledge made her press herself even deeper into the mattress, as if she could disappear under the layers and achieve some measure of safety. The minutes dragged out painfully, each marked by the lazy tick of the clock. Every second felt doubled, tripled, stretched out to impossibility. She could not make herself look away, afraid that the watcher might get closer if she let it slip from her sight. Her skin prickled with memory, the dreams she once had of being chased, never able to run fast enough, always feeling something just behind her. Only now, she wasn't even allowed to move. Her entire world was this bed, this old room, and the shadow at her feet. A strange pressure settled over her legs, distant but unmistakable, until she felt sure her own weight was slowly slipping away. She wanted to scream, or to run, but her limbs felt sunk in heavy sleep stone, numb and useless. Without warning, the air lightened, the weight gone, the room somehow emptier. The watcher's shape softened until it was only gloom again, nothing more than a collection of shades. Her breath came back in slow, jerky gulps. The clock read 3:26 now. She lay there, still frozen in place, waiting for something else to happen. The sky was turning the faintest pale blue when Evelyn finally moved. She let out a sharp, quiet gasp. Her ankle, the one closest to the foot of the bed, stung with a quick, cold fire. Dragging back the blanket, she set her feet on the icy floor and reached down, searching through the confusion of sleep and fear. There, on her bare skin, were small imprints, narrow, smudged, impossibly cold, as though the chill itself had left a mark. Fingerprints, 5 of them pressed into her flesh. She sat for a long time, rubbing the skin, watching the marks fade into mottled blue and pink. The silence inside the house grew brighter, beginning to loosen its hold as the light strengthened. Every sound, the chirp of a bird outside, the groan of the pipes, felt deeper and stranger, as if the world had turned a half-step away from what it should be. Evelyn dressed in the heaviest sweater she could find. She made coffee, ignoring the urge to check the bedroom for any sign of the watcher's presence. The cold lingered around her ankles. By midday, she found herself searching online for any story about her house. She read quickly, following her fear rather than reason, local news, message boards, even the dry reports in the county archives. No one had written about anything tragic, at least nothing she could find. No deaths, no fires, no mysteries reported. The house was just old, forgotten by most, a place people drove past without a second thought. She hoped that should have been comforting, but the absence of stories felt wrong, as if the silence itself was hiding something. For the rest of the day, Evelyn barely left her couch. She jumped at small sounds, her nerves strung tight. She saw no one. Answered no messages. watched the sunset again alone through the slanted panes of glass. The bruised light reminded her of the bedroom, the space at the foot of her bed where the watcher came. Even as she tried to distract herself, she felt herself waiting, bracing for that exact moment, 3:17 a.m., when the night would gather itself again and ask her what she was truly afraid of. The cold felt sharper than usual, wrapping itself around the edges of Evelyn's bed even before she turned out the light. The little heater hummed in the corner, struggling against the ancient drafts. She piled her heaviest quilt and the awkward, fluffless comforter over herself, but still felt the air's chill at her ankles, as though the cold had learned her shape and was determined to slip underneath her. She took longer than usual getting ready for bed. Her movements felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, as she moved from the doorway to the bedside table, setting down small things she hoped would keep her safe. She placed her mother's candle, a stub of lavender wax barely an inch tall, in its chipped saucer. It looked small in the heavy gloom. On impulse she gathered extra couch pillows from the living room, stacking 2 thick ones and a scrappy throw pillow where her feet would go, building a makeshift barrier. She wasn't sure what she expected, something solid, something soft, anything better than empty, expectant space at the foot of the bed. She paused before climbing in, rubbing her finger along the salt shaker she dug out of the kitchen drawer. Her memories were inconsistent, but she half remembered her grandmother pressing salt across a windowsill, whispering that it was protection against things that walked at night. Evelyn poured a careful line all the way around the mattress. The salt line was crooked and patchy near the back, where her reach faltered, but she nodded to herself, pressing down the sharp flutter of embarrassment in her chest. If nothing else, she told herself, it was a declaration, a way of pushing back against the shapeless dread that had settled over her. She lay back, pulling the covers until they bunched at her chin, the ring of salt circling her like a fragile net. She reached for her book, its familiar weight steadying her hands, and read a page and a half under the lamp's yellow glow before the words started to blur. The wind tumbled along the outside of the house, rattling the old glass. The wooden bones of the place shifted and creaked, as if waking up in the dark. Soft, occasional sighs slipped through the plaster walls. She caught herself holding her breath, listening again for that one moment when silence gets too thick, when the darkness feels heavier than just the absence of light. Evelyn forced herself to read another page. She tried to ignore the tingling along her spine, the sense of being watched that grew as the hour drew closer. She looked at her clock, 2:58, minutes stretching slow and stubborn. Each time she forced her eyes shut, shivery images pressed against the backs of her eyelids, a shadow bending at the foot of her bed, a stillness pooling at her toes, a gaze she could not meet. She swallowed and turned on her side, facing away from the clock. She told herself again that she was safe, that the salt and the candles and the pillows would make the room her own again. But sleep came on despite her fear, quick and sticky, a black tide pulling her under just before the world could spill over into real terror. The familiar pressure was gentle at first, so faint that she half convinced herself it was only the quilt shifting beneath her feet. Then it pressed firmer, as if someone had ever so softly set their hand atop her toes through the heavy covers. Evelyn's mind tried to swim up from sleep, but the feeling lingered. The old mattress dipped at the foot of the bed, just a little. Her toes curled, her body tensing as she realized it was happening again, just as it had before, but now it was unmistakable. A weight settling, a presence that was not supposed to be here, her body stilled, every nerve suddenly awake. A burning bolt of panic rushed through her, but she couldn't shout, couldn't move. Her breathing grew shallow, chest rising and falling far too fast, and between one breath and the next, she was no longer sure if she was dreaming or awake. Was she still asleep? Was she paralyzed, trapped on the edge between nightmare and the real? The powerlessness was the worst part. She felt hands again, not grasping but steady, pinning her feet with a careful, almost affectionate pressure. Her heart thudded in her ears, loud enough that the walls seemed to pulse with the sound. The weight was overwhelmingly solid now, no longer a suggestion, but something undeniable. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, but the feeling did not fade. Was that breath? A slow, quiet exhale, as though someone else counted the seconds with her. A part of her mind screamed to push back, to fight. Her hands inched up beneath her pillow, clutching at the cold cotton, searching in vain for something sharp or real. She thought of the salt circle and almost wept at the memory. It seemed so thin now, so fragile and foolish. Whatever sat at the foot of her bed did not care for salt or candles. It cared only to be noticed. With effort, she managed to flex her ankle. The weight did not shift. She opened her eyes, staring out across the darkened room. The house groaned somewhere deep in its bones, the sound stretching and settling, as if the old timbers exhaled in sympathy. It was then that Evelyn understood the sorrow. She could not see who, or what, sat within the gloom at her feet, but she felt it, an overwhelming, old sadness that flowered in the darkness and spread toward her. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even particularly threatening. Instead, it radiated a loss so full and so sharp she almost sobbed in its presence. The kind of loss that had nowhere left to go. She stared into the darkness, eyes blurred, and her mind spun unmoored circles around the memory of her own grief, her empty bed, the echoing silence that greeted her each time she opened the front door, the bitter taste of divorce papers long since signed. The watcher moved, almost imperceptibly, its presence growing heavier. The hush deepened. All Evelyn could hear was her own shaky breathing and the dull rattle of old glass in the window. Something burbled in the far corner of the room, a gurgle from the pipes or perhaps just the house, yet she could not resist the certainty that the watcher's lament had made that sound, that it was trying to speak through the pressure, through the seeping sadness. She listened, desperate, straining for words in the muffled whispers that drifted just beyond hearing. A word. A name. Or only breath. Dark syllables filled her ears, threading through her mind like drifting smoke. Each night, she realized, the watcher was closer, its edge sharper, its form less forgiving. Sometimes it wept softly, the salt taste of tears threading through the air like an echo. Sometimes it simply sat, breathing along with her, matching her heartbeat with a patience that belonged to someone who had lost all urgency. And each time the clock ticked over to 3:17, something about the world inside her bedroom shifted. It felt like being lowered into deep water, a hush that pressed her senses flat. When dawn crept gray and thin through her blinds, Evelyn found herself sitting up in bed, her cheeks wet, knees drawn to her chest beneath the tangled quilt. She had not moved during the night. She stared down at the salt line, scattered and broken, white grains darkened by the uneven floor. The candles had gone cold, their little wicks dipped in their own waxen tears. The day that followed was thinner at the edges. She drifted through work in a daze, answering emails out of order, losing track of conversations until colleagues gave up and left her to her silence. At home, the house was less haven and more mausoleum, each window reflecting her image as she passed through lamplit rooms. But tonight, as she stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth, she saw something new, a shape, vague, slightly hunched, standing just behind her in the reflection. She spun around, breath seizing in her throat, but the room was empty. Only the rattle of pipes and the weary tick of her heart filled the space. Still, she could feel it, the watcher's presence stretching across the daylight, blurring the safe hours into one long, restless dusk. Night approached again. She gathered her pillows and candles, laid down another line of salt, and checked the clock. 2:50, she wondered, as her eyes burned with exhaustion, who would keep watch with her tonight, and whether she would ever see its face. Evelyn drifted somewhere between waking and sleep, her mind muddied by too many nights without rest. Her body no longer felt like her own, it was a shell delivered to bed by habit and dread. She didn't remember falling into sleep, only that somehow 3:17 a.m. came again, finding her as it always did, lying on her back with her hands flat at her sides, thin bedsheets tangled around her ankles, the old clock burning its strange hour in the gloom. The room belonged to the dark, and the dark belonged to the house. She heard the familiar creak on the floorboards, a single sound, squarely at the foot of the bed. This was the sound she had grown to fear more than any memory, more than any living voice. It was quiet but certain. The watcher had come. There was weight this time, unmistakable, not the lightness of uncertain dreams, but a pressure that shifted the mattress and pressed her feet into the dip of the bed. Evelyn stared past her feet, into the black. For once, she did not close her eyes, she could not. Instead, she tried to separate the watcher's shape from the heavier shadows, searching for the outline that must have sat there every other night, waiting for her to look. Something indistinct but undeniable filled the emptiness by her toes, interrupting the border between blanket and air. It almost looked like a person, knees drawn up, arms loose at their sides. She sensed eyes fixed on her, quietly, patiently, as if measuring each frightened breath she took. She heard her own voice, small and drained, whisper into the stillness. "What do you want?" At first, nothing happened. Only the darkness, the freezing air, the heavy, ancient quiet of the house, that deep, tired hush that seemed to hold her aloft in the bed. But then the watcher shifted, just slightly, almost as if answering an invitation. The mattress groaned under new weight. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, as if careful not to frighten her further. She could see it more clearly now. Its outline rippled in the cold light, neither solid nor just shadow. There was an impression of long hair, a bent neck, the suggestion of hands laid gently over sharp knees. Evelyn's heart rattled inside her chest, her breath shallow and loud in her own ears. The figure's face was wrong, it flickered, unresolved, cut by edges of grief and hunger. Something inside the watcher wanted, needed, and could not let go. Then, impossibly, she heard her name. Evelyn. It was spoken in her mother's voice, the voice she remembered from sick days and thunderstorms, gentle and steady, calling her in from the rain. For a moment, she could almost believe it was real, that she was not alone in this house, that her mother sat at the end of her bed like when she was a child, stroking her hair, promising her that everything would be all right. But the voice was hollow, stretched thin, carrying a weight of old sorrow. Evelyn. The sound pressed into Evelyn's bones, colder than the air. Her mother had been gone for years, buried beneath the same winter soil now covering this brittle house. Evelyn wanted to cry, or to reach out, anything to tear away from this dark faceless visitor. But her arms would not move. The pressure at the foot of the bed doubled, then spread, heavier, pinning her calves, pushing her chest into the mattress. Her lungs shrunk and she could not fill them fully. She realized she was completely paralyzed, frozen not only by fear but by something in the air, a thick hush deeper than silence itself. She tried to move her hands, even a finger, but she felt only numbness. Panic lapped at her, cold and rising, but she could not change it. All she could do was lie there and watch as the figure leaned closer, bending over her legs, its shape shifting in the gloom. Its face seemed to blur and rearrange, not quite human, but full of a longing so sharp it stung her skin. The shape bent so near that she could sense icy breath on her exposed knee, even though she wore her thickest flannel pants. At its edges, the darkness grew thin and restless, as if other faces and shadows swirled there, a flicker of her sister's childhood pigtails, her father's work-rough hands, all distorted and just out of reach. She felt the weight of years of loss, the ache of old regrets grown into something hungry and alive. The clock on the nightstand let out a soft, mechanical click, marking the minute's slow crawl. 3:18, Evelyn's vision wobbled. She knew she was not asleep, she had never been more certain of her own body, even as it refused her. She understood, in a wordless, animal way, that she was being watched, not just by the figure, but by the house itself. Every crooked beam, every shuddering windowpane, every inch of hollowed plaster was holding her story, holding her in place. The silence became a second skin. She felt herself measured, each shallow breath, each panicked beat of her heart, as if the watcher was deciding whether she could be remembered, or claimed, or simply left behind. It was not anger or malice, but something colder. Patience, endless and inhuman. She became certain that whatever sat at the end of her bed had always been there, waiting for the exact moment her loneliness unfurled wide enough to allow it inside. As she stared up at the wrinkled ceiling, Evelyn tried to speak again, but no sound left her throat. The weight at her feet yielded not an inch. The room seemed to fold around her. Time slowed until she could hear, one by one, the old pipes contracting, the house adjusting to her presence. She thought perhaps if daylight would only come, the watcher would slip away, retreating to whatever torn part of the darkness it came from. But the minute hand barely moved. She wondered how many nights and how many houses the watcher would wait, silent and unblinking, for the next soul too tired to keep it out. Light, dim and gray, finally spilled onto the faded rug. The weight vanished so suddenly she gasped, filling her lungs in a rush. Her hands twitched. When she looked at the foot of her bed, there was no dent in the old comforter, nothing to show that anyone had ever been there at all. But she felt the imprint of invisible eyes lingering, a cold patch pressed against her skin. Evelyn rose at dawn, the house as brittle and empty as the minute after a storm. She forced herself into the kitchen, moving slow, bracing herself against the edge of the counter. The digital clock blinked to 6:01 a.m. Her hands shook as she poured water, as she fumbled with the pills she now took each morning. The memory of the watcher followed her, heavy as a shadow, settling in her bones. She wondered if she would ever sleep again, or if every night for the rest of her life would pause at 3:17, waiting for her to notice, not just a figure in the darkness, but all the quiet the old house had learned to keep. She told herself she might sleep through it one day, might forget the cold hand at her feet, the voice that was almost, but not quite, her mother's. But as the sun fought its way through tarnished glass, Evelyn realized she did not believe it. The watcher would come again, and she would be there, measured, remembered, haunted by patience that was older than walls and thicker than dreams. She set her mug down with a trembling hand and listened to the silence settle. The clock in the bedroom ticked over, minute by minute, each one carrying her further from sleep, and closer to the next 3:17.